All right, so if you really want to get a handle on the conflict in Ukraine, you have to understand how all sides see it. Today, we're going to do just that by breaking down the perspective of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. We'll be looking at a recent interview where he lays out his view on the history, what he calls the root causes, and Russia's vision for how this could all end.
You know, the interview kicks off with something a little unexpected, a question about a USSR sweatshirt he was wearing. And his answer, it kind of sets the stage for everything else. He says, look, it's not about imperialism, it's simply about history. And that idea, that you have to view everything that's happening now through a very specific historical lens, well, that's a theme that's going to pop up again and again.
Okay, first up, Lavrov paints a picture of two completely different diplomatic styles he's dealt with. On one hand, you've got the Trump administration, and on the other, European leaders. And in his telling, they couldn't be more different.
So here's the breakdown from his point of view. He basically says the Trump team had a much deeper approach. They wanted to get to the bottom of the causes of the conflict, to find a real long-term fix. But Europe? He describes their approach as kind of superficial. You know, just pushing for a quick ceasefire, while at the same time he claims sending weapons to Ukraine and ignoring what he calls human rights violations. All of this, he says, is based on the simple story that Russia just unprovokedly attacked.
And this quote, this really drives home how he felt about it. He talks about a very good atmosphere in those talks with the former U.S. team. The key takeaway for him was that they seemed to genuinely want, in his words, long-term stable and reliable results, not just a Band-Aid solution.
Okay, so he keeps talking about these root causes, right? So what are they? From his perspective, what are the big justifications for Russia's actions? Well, he lays out two main ones. Let's get into it.
Cause number one, he claims, is all about the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine being systematically violated. He points to a whole list of things, a supposed ban on the Russian language, serious restrictions on Russian education and media, even laws that he says essentially ban the main Ukrainian Orthodox Church. He frames all of this as a flat-out violation of the UN Charter.
And here's the real kicker, the contradiction he points to. He says, look at the Ukrainian constitution itself. Ironically, it still says the government has to fully protect the rights of Russians and other minorities. So his whole argument is that the Ukrainian government is breaking its own fundamental laws.
All right, the second big root cause he talks about, it's NATO. The entire argument here is built on what he calls decades of broken promises. It all started, he says, back in the 90s with verbal promises that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. And then what happened? He points to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 waves of expansion that pushed NATO's military right up against Russia's doorstep.
And he's quick to point out that this wasn't just some handshake deal. He brings up a formal principle called indivisible security. This was actually signed in writing at major summits. And the idea is pretty straightforward. You can't make yourself safer if it makes someone else less safe. Simple as that.
And that's where his whole argument comes together. He says NATO's expansion to the east just completely trampled all over that signed agreement. That NATO, and I'm quoting him here, the exact opposite of what was promised. In his view, they were strengthening their own security at the direct expense of Russia's.
So, now that we've heard his why, let's talk about the what. What does Lavrov say Russia's actual goals are in all this? Well, he's very clear that it's not about grabbing land. He frames it as a mission to protect people.
Yeah, he couldn't be more direct on this. He says, and I quote, "We have never sought territory for its own sake. Not Crimea, not Donbas, not Novorossiya." He's flat out denying that this is a land grab.
So if it's not about territory, what is it about? According to him, it's about protection. The stated goal, he says, has always been to protect the Russian people who have lived in those areas for hundreds of years. The people who, in his narrative, built the cities and the ports, and whose rights he claims were being crushed.
Okay, so with all that as the backstory, what's the way out? What does a real, lasting peace settlement look like from Moscow's point of view? Lavrov boils it down to two non-negotiable conditions.
And these two conditions, you'll see, tie right back to those root causes he talked about. First, Russia's security interests have to be fully respected, and the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine have to be guaranteed. And second, Ukraine has to go back to what he says was its promise from 1990, to be a neutral, non-aligned country. In other words, no NATO.
And just to wrap up, the conversation turns to the future of diplomacy, especially with the U.S.
Lavrov makes a point of saying that President Putin has a standing invitation for Donald Trump to visit Moscow and that it's still on the table. It's a pretty clear signal, right? It goes right back to what he was saying at the beginning, that he sees that diplomatic channel as one that was, in his view, more productive.
And that really brings us to the heart of the issue, doesn't it? As we've just walked through, Lavrov's entire argument is built on a very specific reading of history, a story of broken promises and violated rights. And it leaves you with a huge question. How can you ever build a lasting peace, a real settlement, when both sides can't even agree on the basic story of how the whole thing started?